was killed, been in prison, wrongly imprisoned, all the rest of it, and of course they're going to want some justice. So I think it just feeds into, you've got the everyday lived present reality of all the problems of what it is to live normally in Northern Ireland, what it is to have a normal justice system in Northern Ireland. So then if you've got all this unresolved, and not even just the unresolved legacy, I think you've got all the unresolved trauma that goes with that, and guilt and anger and resentment and all those, problems which build up. Of course it's not conducive to anything, normal, normal society. How could it be? Yeah.
And you're saying, and again, just because of the legacy of the way that the violence occurred and where it occurred, perhaps that tends to be in those areas that still tend to be some of the most
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So again, all that legacy stuff, the cross-section of society was harmed by the conflict, but that was mostly concentrated. Most people killed, harmed, shot by paramilitaries, wrongly shot by paramilitaries, killed by the other side. Those things were all in particular, areas, mostly socioeconomically deprived areas. Those are the ones who felt the brunt of the conflict. That legacy is the other layer of complexity to normal life and normal criminal justice as we know it.
Well, and you mentioned earlier, because it seems, again, outside looking in, but it seems that a lot of the other, sometimes lumped under cultural issues, right? When you're thinking about bonfires, flags, parades, right?
Yeah.
Those other ones, which are often seem to be sticking points. It seems that those tend to be much more intense issues in more deprived or marginalized communities as well, right?
Yeah.
You see less of that in the leafy areas than you do.
Yeah, of course.
Do you think that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so there's some people are running joke is, some places are too middle class to give a shit about sectarianism. They just get, because they are fortunate enough to have access to normal lives which don't depend, now it's not to say sectarian attitudes exist in all walks of life, all layers, to the highest levels of government, as we know, but most of those symbolic issues, again, a lot of it tends to boil down to identity complex and a sense of because a lot of communities' identity is one of the few things they have left. When you listen to any of sort of the narratives coming out of the loyalist, particularly loyalist communities, around bonfires and flags and culture. It is this language of culture, and our culture is being diminished and our identity is being you've got the greening of the political agenda. So I think a lot of it is it's insecurity about identity and the direction that things are going. And even people daring to have conversations about a united Ireland. I'm sure you followed the last while. There was Colin Harvey from the law school here, was absolutely getting it in the neck from unionist politicians about Queen's. I think it was Steve Aiken, the leader of the UUP, was saying Queens need to rein in their academic staff, censorship around having sensible debates around. Well, actually, do you know what? Now, because of Brexit, in 20 years' time, there might be a border poll. Actually, some people say, well, actually, we need to have a conversation about this, and then other people are, getting very hot and heavy. So I think identity is much more of an issue on the loyalist unionist side, as I would see it. Again, those are issues which tend to reside, in socio-economically deprived areas. As you said, you don't get bonfires in leafy suburbs of South Belfast. You get bonfires, lower Newtownards Road in East Belfast, up in Dundonald and Shankill, and Craig and wherever. I don't think it's any coincidence where people gravitate towards some sense of who they are and then try to protect some sense of who they are. So, absolutely, if people want to have bonfires, I don't have a problem with that, but, then let's not, layer on that you see that's part of your culture, having a bonfire. Brilliant, but then, and it morphs into something else, and then it becomes this battle, the sort of race to the bottom of us versus them, and lack of inclusivity, and then, the whole flags protest in 2012-13, that was a very semi-violent expression of, we don't want our identity to be diminished, and we had the 3 months of protests as a result of that. So mostly for me, I wouldn't see that so much. Now there's certainly some element of that on Republican side. With some of the paramilitary marches and all that sort of stuff you get down, in particular areas. But for me, from what I can see, it is. Identity is still a big thing because it's one of the few things that some places have left. If you have no major attachment to your community, it's one of those communities that's gone through the middle of the conflict, and your British Unionist loyalist identity, that's absolutely fine to have that, but it doesn't need to be erased to the bottom of protection by violence. But that's what some people like to perpetuate.
Yeah, it's just the thing that made me think of that in particular was just when you're talking about the normalization, and if this had happened in any other place, say in the United Kingdom or in Europe, whole cities would shut down. And I just think about that sometimes, some of that low-level violence around bonfires, right, where people are setting up these huge health and safety hazards in some ways, right, like in violating municipal ordinances and so on and so forth, but police can't even move in, or if a contractor moves in, they have to
they're threatened, all that stuff. So that there is still this sort of violence still always lurks in the background. I think that is still this recourse to violence. It's always there. Because it always was there. People are starting to move away from that, but there's this again, even the language now around the whole Brexit stuff. There's this sort of cold arms type language happening in the loyalist unionist community. Defend our areas and defend unionism, and that's fine if you feel that Brexit's going to diminish your loyalist identity. That's fine, but why does it have to be? Why is it there have to be a violent response? In 2019, why do we not have some articulate unionist politicians arguing the corner of loyalism? Not this. Well, we're going to come out onto the streets like the flag protest times 10 and bring the country to a standstill. That's the sort of the subtle insinuation of these recent meetings at the Con Club and the rally at the Ulster Hall. It's essentially a veiled threat, I think, of mass civil disruption like we've had many times over the years. So that the fact that there is still a capacity and a propensity for that, maybe not as big a scale, but the fact that can still happen is still a bit of a worrying thing, and there are communities and people and individuals and groups are still prepared to do that. That's not a great place to be. And again, that just drags in young people. It drags in people who can and would be, influence. So it's all walks of life, but particularly young people, 21 years after the Good Friday Agreement, are still being exposed to this stuff. So that is to some extent how it is still being transmitted and perpetuated. Where and how can we pull down a stop to some of this? I don't have the answer to that. It's for the politicians to do something about. We can only sort of call it, from the criminologists, call what we see. We don't necessarily have the solutions for anything or everything.
Well, on that happy note.
Yes, I know. You could get quite depressed about this stuff. But, I think it's always a thing to keep in mind. We do, I think, we have come a long way, but it's just, I think it's always important to keep one very close eye on that asymmetrical spread of the conflict and asymmetrical spread of where violence and the propensity for violence still actually happens, because if you forget that, then you're excluding a large section of society, a large minority of society, because peace process, everybody is meant to come along, so you can't have a peace process for some people and not others, and you can't just conveniently ignore that those people in loyalist and Republican communities who aren't feeling the benefits. You can't just sort of shove them off to a corner. They're part of society and meant to be part of society, and if you don't have them, you don't have a fully implemented peace process, and therefore why would we be surprised that things unravel at the edges at particular points and moments in time?
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
And can I ask you before we go? You were mentioning CRJI, or if there's some folks there that you think.
Yes, I could certainly. We have our final board meeting of the year on Friday, so we have all our board members there. I can certainly, I'll say to Harry or Jim, I can sort of connect you up via email to get a chat, because as I said, Harry, he'd sit down and tell you the story himself. But he was in the H blocks, during the 90s. He was second in command at the H blocks. He was very high up. Remember